For 3 straight days, Aaron had been forced to watch his homeworld burn. He stared out the observation window as another city was wiped from existence in a silent, blinding flash. The Kreveth weren't just winning, they were erasing his people from history, and he was completely powerless to stop them. What would you do if you knew your entire civilization had only hours left to live? Let us know in the comments, because Aaron was out of options. In the council chamber, half the seats were empty, a grim memorial to the leaders already lost. "What's our fleet status?" Aaron asked, his voice hollow. Lisa's hands trembled as she looked at her data pad. 17 defense cruisers and maybe 40 patrol ships. Against the Kravath's fleet of over 300 warships, the math wasn't just bad, it was an execution order. The Dolin were never fighters. They were explorers, thinkers, and creators. Their ships were designed to map stars and protect trade routes, not to fight a galactic war. The Kravath, on the other hand, were born for conquest, having carved a bloody path across the stars for centuries. "The evacuation transports?" Aaron asked, finally turning to his chief scientist. "The last one got out an hour ago," Lisa whispered, her voice cracking. "We managed to save about 40,000 before they sealed the system." A gut-wrenching pause. "That leaves 12 million people on the surface. 12 million souls who were about to pay the ultimate price for his failure. He'd tried diplomacy. He'd offered to surrender. The Kravath commander had literally laughed in his face. They didn't want his planet or his resources. They just wanted to make an example out of the Dolin, to show the galaxy what happens when you defy them. The entire station jolted from a nearby explosion. Emergency lights flickered on as another of their cruisers vanished from the tactical map, taking 200 more Dolin with it. "Commander Drexen is hailing us again," a communications officer announced grimly. Aaron squared his shoulders. On screen. The face that appeared was pure predator. Drexen had the scaly hide, 4 unblinking eyes, and a jaw full of razor-sharp teeth that his species was infamous for. He was smiling. "Counselor Aaron, have you finally come to your senses and are ready to offer your unconditional surrender?" Aaron kept his voice steady. "We both know there's nothing left to surrender. You've already taken everything." Drexen's smile grew wider, more sinister. "I know, but I want to hear the words. I want to hear the great Dolin Republic admit that they were nothing more than a momentary nuisance. You should have accepted our offer to join the Dominion when you had the chance. We refused because we're not interested in being your slaves." "Slaves, subjects, citizens. Semantics, Behe," Drexen sneered. "The only thing that matters is that we are strong and you are weak. We always win." He leaned in, as if sharing a secret. "Your pathetic little fleet will be space dust within the hour. Then my troops will land, and we'll go city by city. I hear Dolin are quite delicate. My soldiers are very eager to find out just how delicate." Aaron fought to control his rage. "There are galactic laws. The Council has rules for treating civilian populations. The Galactic Council is 3 months away. They're too spineless to challenge the Dominion," Drexen scoffed. "By the time they're done arguing about what to do, your entire species will be a forgotten ghost in their history books." The transmission cut out, leaving Aaron in a crushing silence, the weight of every terrified gaze in the room pressing down on him. They were looking for a miracle, and he had none to give. Counselor, Lisa said, her voice a bare whisper. There might be one last thing, one desperate play we haven't made. What? We've exhausted every possibility. The ancient beacon. The name sent a chill down Aaron's spine. It was a myth, a relic from a time before his people had even discovered space travel. It was a colossal, mysterious piece of technology that no one truly understood, left behind by the legendary Old Ones, the first civilization to ever travel faster than light before they vanished 10,000 years ago. That beacon hasn't been turned on in all of recorded history, Aaron said. We have no idea if it even works. The archives say it's a universal distress call, Lisa insisted, pulling up a holographic display of glowing ancient text. It broadcasts a plea for help in every known language across the entire galaxy. To who? The Old Ones are gone, Lisa. I know, she said, pointing to a specific passage, but the records mention something else. They speak of those who sleep in the dark places and the guardians from the world of death. The Old Ones believed that if the call was ever made, someone, somewhere would answer. That's a bedtime story, Lisa. Maybe, she said, her eyes pleading with his. But what other choice do we have? We're already gone, Aaron. This way, at least we go down swinging. Another blast rocked the station, this one powerful enough to throw them off balance. The Cravath were closing in for the kill. Aaron didn't hesitate. Do it. Activate the beacon. They raced through the deserted corridors to a chamber 3 levels down, a room he hadn't seen since he was a child on a school trip. In the center of the room, a massive crystalline structure pulsed with a soft internal light, like a sleeping giant's heart. Lisa rushed to a control panel, her fingers flying over controls that hadn't been touched in thousands of years. A low, deep hum began to fill the room, a vibration you could feel in your bones. Is it working? Aaron yelled over the noise. I don't know. The text just says it activates when powered on. It will keep broadcasting until it gets a response, or the power fails. How long will that take? Based on these readings? About 3 years. 3 years of shouting into an empty abyss, praying that they would be heard. Aaron wasn't sure they would last the next 3 hours. The chamber's view screen showed the brutal reality of the battle outside. Their last few ships fought with incredible courage, but they were being torn apart one by one. As Aaron and Lisa watched their final defenders die, the beacon pulsed behind them, sending its desperate cry out into the cold, uncaring darkness. But somewhere, in the forgotten voids between the stars, something heard it. And on a small blue world the rest of the galaxy had tried its best to forget, an alarm began to scream. Admiral Helen Cross despised being bored. She was sitting in her office at United Earth Defense Command, buried in supply reports that a junior officer should have been handling. But that's what peace got you. Humanity's fleet spent most of its time patrolling its own backyard, staring into an empty frontier that no one dared cross. 200 years ago, when humans first broke the light-speed barrier, the Galactic Council had welcomed them and then immediately put them in quarantine. Officially, it was a cultural adjustment period. The truth? Humanity terrified every other race they'd encountered. A chime from her desk terminal broke the silence, a Priority 1 alert from the Deep Space Monitoring Station on Pluto. Admiral, We're detecting a signal unlike anything we've ever seen. It's broadcasting on every frequency in hundreds of languages, including perfect English. Helen leaned forward, suddenly interested. What is it? It's a distress call, ma'am. The technology is ancient, but unbelievably powerful. Origin is the outer spiral arm about 800 light-years out. Our computers have translated it. It's coming from a group called the Dolin Republic. They're being annihilated and are begging for help from anyone listening. Have we ever heard of the Dolin? No, Admiral. They're not in our database. According to galactic maps, their territory is on the far side of Council space. We've never been granted clearance to go that far. Helen felt a familiar fire ignite in her gut, one that had been dormant for far too long. Get me President Garcia now, and I want every piece of intel we have on that sector of space. 20 minutes later, Helen was in the Situation Room, the President and the Joint Chiefs watching the main screen. The desperate voice of Counselor Aaron filled the air. Our worlds are under attack by the Krevith Dominion. Our defenses have failed. Millions of civilians are dying. We are broadcasting this message in the hope that someone, anyone, will hear us. Please, if there is anyone out there who values peace and justice, we beg you to help us. We cannot hold much longer. The message looped, a ghost's plea echoing through the stars. The Kravath Dominion, an intelligence officer spoke up. They're bad news, a major military power that steamrolled about 40 star systems. The Council is too scared to do anything but watch. President Garcia looked directly at Helen. If we went, could we even get there in time? If we leave immediately with our fastest ships, we can be there in 72 hours. But ma'am, the Council will see this as a major violation. We're supposed to stay in our corner. Do we need their permission to answer an SOS? Legally, no. An ancient galactic law says any species capable of providing aid must respond to a legitimate distress signal. But we'd be the first to ever use it. Garcia stared at the map, at the tiny distant speck that was the Dolin Republic, all alone and facing extinction. How many ships can you get in the air? Helen had been waiting to hear that question her entire career. A grim smile touched her lips. I can have 6 battle fleets ready to launch in 4 hours. That's 36 heavy cruisers, 72 destroyers, and 200 support craft. She paused for effect. Plus the Ragnarok. A hush fell over the room. Everyone knew about the Ragnarok, the secret experimental dreadnought humanity had built using forbidden technology, a ship so powerful the Council believed it was too dangerous to even exist. It was the biggest warship humanity had ever built, armed with weapons that would make the so-called civilized galaxy blush. Do it, Garcia, the Admiral ordered. All of it. Send them every single thing we've got. Helen, the communications officer, broke into a wide grin. Yes, ma'am. 4 hours later, Admiral Helen Cross stood on the command deck of her flagship, the UEES Valiant. Through the massive viewport, she watched her fleet fall into place, a perfectly choreographed dance of steel and fire born from 2 centuries of relentless training. Humanity hadn't fought a real war in generations, but they had never, ever forgotten how. Her second-in-command, Captain Dan Reed, strode onto the bridge. He was young for a captain, only 35, but he'd earned his stripes in countless war games. More importantly, He was one of the few who still truly believed in the fleet's purpose. Admiral, all ships are green across the board, ready for departure. Good, she said, her voice firm. Send a message to the Dolin. Tell them we're on our way, then get us moving. In a brilliant flash of blue light, the fleet vanished. Behind them, Earth was a silent blue marble. Ahead lay a rescue mission that could change everything. Just 3 hours into their journey, an urgent message buzzed through from Galactic Council headquarters. The face of Ambassador Thesson, a tall bird-like creature assigned to keep an eye on Earth, appeared on the main screen. He looked frantic. Admiral Cross, we've detected your fleet's movement. You have to turn back. Now! We're answering a distress call, Ambassador. Galactic law is very clear on this. You don't get it, he chirped, his voice strained. The Dolin situation is an internal matter for the Dominion. The Kravath have claimed that territory. The Council has voted not to get involved. Helen's jaw tightened. Then it's a good thing we're not bound by the Council's vote. Admiral, please. The ambassador's feathers were puffed out, a clear sign of extreme distress. Your entire species was quarantined for a reason. You come from a death world. Do you have any idea what that actually means? Your planet's gravity is nearly double the standard. Your storms are catastrophic. Your predators would be considered biological weapons on most planets. You are built to survive a place that would kill most of us in a matter of days. I'm familiar with Earth's classification, she said coldly. Then you must realize that when you show up in Dolin space, you will scare them to death. And when you fight the Kravath, you will horrify them. Humanity's way of fighting. It's disturbing to the rest of the galaxy. You use kinetic slugs, chemical explosives, tactics built on an endurance for pain that other species can't even comprehend. We didn't quarantine you because you're evil. We quarantined you because we don't know how to handle a species of natural-born warriors who refuse to play by our rules. Helen's anger began to boil over. So you'd rather stand by and let millions of innocent people be slaughtered than risk us ruffling a few feathers? The ambassador closed his eyes, defeated. I'm trying to warn you. After this, there's no going back. The galaxy will finally see what humanity is capable of, and they will fear you for it. Let them, Helen snapped. We're going. Then I will pray the Dolin survive what's coming, Thesson whispered. And I will pray the rest of us can survive knowing the humans have been unleashed. The transmission cut out. Dan looked over at Helen. Do you think he's right? That we'll scare them? Probably, she admitted. But people are dying, and they asked for our help. Nothing else matters. She turned back to the star-dusted view ahead. Besides, maybe it's about time the galaxy got a real lesson about humanity. We may be from a death world, but that doesn't make us monsters. It just makes us incredibly good at protecting those we care about. The fleet silently tore through the darkness. 72 hours to save a people they'd never met. 72 hours to prove the quarantine was a mistake. 72 hours until the galaxy found out what happens when you poke a sleeping bear. When the human fleet dropped out of warp on the edge of Dolin space, it was like watching ghosts materialize from thin air. Counselor Aaron was in the emergency command bunker when a new alarm blared. His people had already learned to tell the difference between the siren for another Kravath attack and the one for something new. This was the new one. Counselor, we have massive energy readings on the edge of the system. Initial scans show 38 capital ships and over 200 smaller vessels. Their design is unknown. Their tech is unknown, but they're not Kravoth. Aaron's heart hammered in his chest. The beacon. Someone had actually answered their desperate call. Are they friendly? We don't know. They're holding their position in a defensive pattern. Wait, we're getting a transmission, audio only. The voice that filled the bunker was unlike anything Aaron had ever heard. Even through the computer's translation, he could feel its raw power, its unwavering confidence. This is Captain Dan Reed of the United Earth ship Valiant. We've received your distress signal. We're here to help. Please confirm you can hear us. Earth. Aaron racked his brain but came up empty. Lysa, do our records have anything on a species called humans from a planet called Earth? Lysa's fingers were already flying across her console. Nothing in the modern database. Let me check the ancient archives, the ones from the first ones. A moment later, she gasped. I found one reference. It's filed under mythology. It talks about sleepers from the death world of Terra. She looked up, her eyes wide. Terra is another name for Earth. The file says they were guardians. Beings who lived in the forgotten darkness between the stars. That's it. The first ones met them once and immediately declared their world off limits. Classification, Death World Class 12. Class 12? Aaron felt a cold dread wash over him. He'd never heard of a rating higher than 8. What does Class 12 mean? Lysa looked pale as a ghost. It means the planet is so hostile that even considering a visit is classified as suicide. Counselor, I think we may have just called on something far worse than the Cravo. But they were already doomed. Aaron made his choice. Open a channel. Captain Reed, this is Counselor Aaron of the Dolane Republic. We hear you. Are you really here to help? The voice on the other end was calm and steady. That is the only reason we're here. We got your call 3 days ago and came as fast as we could. Tell me your situation. Aaron laid it all out. The brutal Kravath invasion, the orbital bombardment, the millions already lost, and the final assault that was just hours away. On his tactical screen, he saw the unknown ships begin to spread out, shifting their formation, preparing. Understood, Reed said when he finished. We are going to help you, but you need to know something. We will engage the Kravath, and the fight is going to be intense. Our methods might look brutal to you, but I promise we will not let them touch another civilian. Do we have your permission to engage? Yes, please do whatever you have to. Thank you. Just one more thing. Keep your ships clear of the battlefield. We don't want any friendly fire. There was a brief pause. Looks like the Kravath are calling us. This ought to be fun. Commander Drexen had been enjoying a premature victory toast. His troops were ready for the final ground assault. Then, this unknown fleet showed up. At first, he was just annoyed. Now, he was amused. Unidentified ships, this is Commander Drexen of the Kravath Dominion. You are interfering in a sovereign military action. State your name and purpose, then leave immediately. This is Captain Reed of the United Earth Fleet. We're answering a distress call from the Dolane Republic. You're the one who needs to stand down and withdraw. Drexen actually laughed out loud. Earth? Never heard of it. You must be some backwater species that doesn't understand how the galaxy works. This system is ours now. Leave or be turned into scrap." "I gave you your chance," Reed's voice replied flatly. "Remember that." The channel went dead. Still smiling, Drexen ordered 3 of his battle groups to obliterate the newcomers. 30 ships in total, more than enough to teach these nobodies a lesson. The Cravath warships surged forward, their plasma cannons glowing, weapons designed to slice through the toughest armor like a hot knife through butter. Their targeting systems locked on. Drexen leaned back, ready to enjoy the fireworks. But the humans fired first. Drexen's smile evaporated. The tactical display went insane. These primitives weren't using energy weapons. They were launching solid metal slugs from railguns. They were firing missiles tipped with high explosive warheads. These were weapons the civilized galaxy had deemed too savage, too barbaric, and abandoned centuries ago. And they were terrifyingly effective. A Cravath cruiser took 3 railgun slugs to its bow. Its energy shields might as well have been made of paper. The metal projectiles ripped through the armor plating and just kept going, tearing gaping holes straight through the ship. The cruiser broke in half, silently screaming its crew and atmosphere into the void. Drexen watched in sheer disbelief as his fleet was torn to pieces. The human weapons were absolutely devastating. One of his destroyers took a direct hit from a single primitive-looking missile. It detonated deep inside the ship's engine room. The resulting explosion was so bright it made Drexen's eyes water, even through the monitor. "Return fire," Drexen commanded. "All ships concentrate on their lead vessel." The Cravath fleet obeyed instantly. A storm of superheated plasma erupted from their cannons, a wave of energy that should have turned anything in its path to dust. The human flagship took the full force of the blast head-on. Drexen leaned forward, anticipating the satisfying sight of the enemy ship tearing itself apart. But it didn't. Where the plasma hit, the human ship's armor simply glowed white-hot. Entire sections melted away, only to reveal a second layer of armor beneath. The ship never stopped moving, never stopped firing. It absorbed blows that would have obliterated any other vessel, and just kept coming. "What in the stars are those ships made of?" someone on Drexen's bridge whispered in disbelief. The entire battle lasted just 14 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 30 of Drexen's Cravath ships were gone. The humans hadn't lost a single one. A few of their ships showed some scarring, but every last one was still combat-ready. Dan watched the tactical display go silent. The Cravath advance had ground to a halt. "Good," he thought. "Maybe they're finally getting the message." "Captain, the Cravath commander is hailing us again." "Put him on screen." Drexen's face materialized, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by pure shock. "What are you?" he stammered. "We're humans," Dan replied coolly. "We're from a planet called Earth, and we have a zero-tolerance policy for bullies. You use primitive kinetic weapons and explosives. Your ships have no proper shielding. You fight like barbarians." "No," Dan corrected him. "We fight like people with something to protect. Now I'm going to give you one last chance. Stand down, leave this system now, or we will force you to leave. I have 300 ships," Drexen boasted, though his voice wavered. And we took out 30 of them in less than 15 minutes, Dan shot back. Do you really want to find out what happens when we stop playing nice? He leaned in, his voice dropping to a serious tone. Here's what you need to understand, Commander. Back on Earth, we have a saying, never corner something meaner than you are. You picked a fight with the dolphin, a peaceful species. That was your first mistake. Your second mistake was still being here when we answered their call. Drexen's 4 eyes stared at Dan as if he were looking at a ghost. The entire galaxy will hear of this. Good, Dan said with a nod. Let them hear. Let them know that when someone cries out for help, Earth answers. Now, get out. The transmission clicked off. Dan watched as the Krebath fleet slowly, cautiously began to pull back. Well, most of them. Drexen hadn't turned tail and run just yet, but his fleet was now moving with a hesitation that wasn't there before. They had learned a healthy dose of respect. Captain, the communications officer cut in, we're getting a message from the Dolphin. Counselor Aaron is asking what our next move is. Dan gazed down at the planet below. It was scarred, burning, and dying. But maybe, just maybe, not for much longer. Tell him we're just getting started. Colonel Ann Price stared out the window of her drop pod at the surface of the Dolphin homeworld. She could see their cities scattered below. Some were miraculously intact, while others were little more than smoking ruins. The Krebath had landed their occupation forces 2 days ago and now controlled nearly 40% of the planet's surface. That was about to change. All units, this is Colonel Price. We are about to give these Krebath a lesson in what happens when you invade someone's home. Remember your training. Remember why you're here, and never forget that every single civilian we rescue is a victory. The drop pods launched from the human carriers in massive waves. 2,000 Marines were in the first assault, with 5,000 more right behind them. The pods were specifically designed to show up as missiles on Krebath sensors. By the time the invaders realized what was actually heading their way, it would be far too late. Anne felt the familiar gut punch of atmospheric entry as her pod bucked and rattled. The heat shields glowed a terrifying cherry red. Then the retro rockets fired with a roar, and the pod slammed into the ground hard enough to shatter the concrete beneath it. The door blew open with explosive bolts, and Anne was already moving before the smoke even had a chance to clear. The Marines had landed right in the middle of a city park. Krebath troops were everywhere. They'd been using the park as a forward staging area, never expecting an attack from the sky. Anne raised her rifle and opened fire. Humans possessed a few physical advantages that most alien species didn't appreciate until they saw them firsthand. Earth's heavy gravity meant that on lower gravity worlds, every human was stronger and faster. Compared to the Krebath, they moved like blurs of lightning. She sprinted across the park in seconds, her rifle firing in short, controlled bursts. Every shot hit its mark. The Krebath scrambled to respond, but they were hopelessly outmaneuvered and too slow. Anne's squad descended on them from 3 directions at once, using tactics the Krebath had never encountered. They didn't just stand in the open and trade shots like so-called civilized soldiers. They used cover. They used flanking maneuvers. They were in constant motion, a whirlwind of deadly force that was impossible to pin down. A Krabath officer tried to rally his troops, and Anne put 2 rounds through his chest for his trouble. He went down like a sack of rocks. The rest of his unit panicked and ran. The Marines gave chase. "Command, this is Price. Landing zone is secure. We're beginning our sweep of the city." High in orbit, Admiral Cross was the conductor of this violent symphony. The Navy was handling the fight in space, while the Marines were systematically dismantling the ground forces. It was a 2-pronged assault the Krabath were completely unprepared for. Drexen had thrown everything into his surface invasion, leaving his ships in orbit outnumbered and outgunned. Meanwhile, his ground troops were being methodically wiped out by an enemy that fought with a ferocity they couldn't possibly counter. "Commander, we're getting casualty reports from the surface," an officer reported, his voice trembling. "The human ground forces, they're unstoppable." Drexen pulled up the combat footage, and what he saw sent a chill down his spine. Human soldiers moved through the city streets with terrifying efficiency. They cleared entire buildings in a matter of minutes. They set up deadly ambushes that his troops walked into like lambs to the slaughter, and they just never stopped. One clip showed a human Marine getting hit 3 times. The soldier went down. Drexen watched, expecting him to stay down, but he didn't. The Marine got right back up. His armor had stopped 2 of the shots, and the 3rd had gone clean through his shoulder. The human simply slapped a field bandage on the wound and kept on fighting. "They don't stop," one of Drexen's officers whispered in horror. "You shoot them, and they just keep coming." Anne and her squad finally reached a dolphin hospital that the Krabath had turned into a command post. The worst part? There were civilians inside, hostages. This called for a much softer touch. "All right, listen up," Anne said to her team. "We go in quiet. No explosives, no heavy weapons. We get the civilians out first, then we clean house." The Marines slipped into the building through the maintenance tunnels, moving like ghosts despite their heavy armor and gear. They had spent years training in every environment imaginable. Earth had jungles, deserts, and frozen wastelands, and the Marines had learned to master them all. The Krabath guards never even heard them coming. Anne's squad took them down with silenced weapons and combat knives. It was quick, clean, and brutally professional. They cleared 3 entire floors before the Krabath even suspected they weren't alone. They found the civilians huddled in the basement. About 200 Dolphine, mostly women and children, all of them terrified. Anne took off her helmet so they could see her face. "We're here to help," she said softly. "We're going to get you out of here. Just stay quiet and follow my people." A little Dolphine child, maybe 6 years old in human terms, looked up at her with huge, tear-filled eyes. "Are you the guardians from the old stories?" Anne offered a small, reassuring smile, something like that. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's get you all somewhere safe." The evacuation took 20 minutes. The Marines escorted all 200 civilians out through the tunnels and handed them over to the Dolphine emergency services. Then they went back inside for the Krabath. The Krabath commander in the hospital finally realized, far too late, that he was trapped. The humans had sealed every exit. They had cut his communication lines, and now they were coming for him. "Surrender, and you will be treated according to the rules of war." Anne's voice boomed through the building's internal speakers. "Resist, and you will be eliminated. You have 2 minutes to decide." The Krebeth commander chose to resist. It was a fatal mistake.
The Marines hit the command center from 4 different directions at once. Flashbangs and smoke grenades turned the room into a whirlwind of chaos. The Krebeth fired wildly into the blinding confusion. The humans, using thermal imaging, could see perfectly through the smoke. It was all over in 90 seconds. Anne stood over the Krebeth commander. He was wounded, but he was alive. "You're going to stand trial for what you've done here," she told him. "Every civilian you killed, every war crime you committed, all of it." The commander spat on the floor. "Humans don't follow the galactic rules of war. You're savages." "No," Anne replied calmly. "We're just better at it than you are." "There's a big difference." She looked over at her squad. "Get him and the others to the detention area and make sure the medics check them out. We're not them." The battle for the planet raged for 18 hours. By the end of it, the Krebeth occupation force had been utterly crushed. Some surrendered. Some tried to run back to their ships only to be picked off by the Navy, and some fought to the bitter end and died for their cause. In orbit, Admiral Cross reviewed the casualty reports: 37 Marines wounded, 5 killed in action. The Krebeth, on the other hand, had lost over 10,000 ground troops and another 50 ships. Dan stood beside her on the bridge of the flagship, the Valiant. "The Ragnarok is in position," she said quietly. "The Ragnarok." It had been held in reserve, letting the main fleet do most of the heavy lifting, but Drexen still had his primary battle group intact, over 100 heavy warships. He was pulling back, but he still hadn't surrendered. "Show him why he should," Helen said, her voice calm and steady. The Ragnarok moved into view. It was a monster, easily twice the size of any other ship in the human fleet. Its main weapon was a spinal-mounted mass accelerator that ran the entire length of its colossal frame. It was designed to launch a 10-ton projectile at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The targeting computer locked onto the Krebeth formation. Helen gave the order. The Ragnarok fired. The projectile screamed across the void in seconds. It slammed into the lead Krebeth dreadnought, hitting it dead center. The kinetic energy unleashed was so immense that the warship didn't explode. It simply ceased to exist. But the projectile wasn't finished. It tore through a second dreadnought, then a third, then a fourth, a fifth, and a sixth. 6 battleships, gone in a flash of light. From his command chair, Drexen watched the impossible happen, and a feeling he hadn't experienced in his entire military life washed over him. Pure, gut-wrenching terror. He slammed the comms button. "All ships, hold your fire! I repeat, stand down!" He frantically opened a channel to the human fleet. "We surrender," he choked out. "Our surrender is complete and unconditional. Just, please, no more." Dan's face, calm and unyielding, appeared on the main view screen. "Power down all weapon systems. Prepare to be boarded. Any sign of resistance will result in your immediate annihilation. Is that clear?" Drexen could only nod. "Yes, crystal clear." The transmission ended. Dan turned to Helen beside him. "We did it. We won." Helen gazed at the scarred planet below them, a world burned but finally free. "No," she said softly. "They won. We just gave them a fighting chance."
Down on the surface, Aaron walked through the ruins of his own capital city. Everywhere he looked, human Marines were deep in the rescue efforts. He saw a squad carefully digging through a collapsed building, pulling survivors from the rubble. He watched a human medic treat a wounded Dolphine child with the same gentle focus she'd give one of her own. Lissa found him standing amidst the wreckage. "The beacon. It actually worked," she whispered. "The guardians from the old stories. They're real." "They're not guardians, Lissa. They're soldiers," Aaron replied, watching another Marine, a kid who couldn't be much older than 20, carry an elderly Deline woman to safety. "But maybe," he added, "that's exactly what we needed." News of what happened in Doline space spread through the galaxy like a shockwave.
Ambassador Thesson watched the Galactic Council chamber erupt into pure chaos. Representatives from 200 different species were all shouting, pointing fingers, and demanding to know what had just happened. All of this because of the events in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. The battle footage was already playing on the central display for the third time. Human ships tearing through a Krabath fleet with brutal efficiency. Human Marines moving through city streets like apex predators. And the final, terrifying shot, the human flagship, Ragnarok, firing its unbelievable weapon and wiping out 6 capital ships in a single, silent burst. Every species in that room watched with a different emotion. For some, it was horror. For others, fascination. And for a select few, it was a spark of hope. "This is precisely what we have always feared," boomed Counselor Van of the Pelthrin Union. "The humans have shown military power that goes far beyond any of our worst projections. They used weapons we would consider barbaric. Their tactics are unnecessarily violent. They are a danger to the entire galaxy's stability."
"They saved millions of innocent people," a quieter voice cut through the noise. It was Counselor Mira from the Helen Federation. "The Kreveth were committing genocide, and this council did nothing. Earth answered a distress call and stopped a slaughter." "How is that a threat?" "Because they're Deathworlders." Ven's voice cracked with emotion. "Don't you understand what that means? They evolved on a planet where every living thing was trying to kill them. Their world has nearly twice the standard gravity. Their planet's weather can produce storms that would flatten our cities. Their predators would make our most hardened warriors tremble. They are built for violence in a way we can barely imagine." Ambassador Thesson finally rose to his feet. "I was the one who warned Earth not to get involved. I told them the galaxy would judge them by the ferocity of their fighting, but I was wrong about something crucial." He brought up new footage on the main screen. "I thought they would be monsters. I thought they would kill without mercy. Look at." The screen showed a human Marine, covered in dust, gently carrying a small Dolphine child out of a burning building. Another clip showed human medics treating wounded civilians before they even tended to their own soldiers. A third showed human engineers already working to rebuild a shattered hospital. "They fight like demons," Thesson said, his voice ringing with conviction. "But they protect like angels." Every single report coming out of Doline space tells the same story. The humans were violent only when they had to be, and gentle whenever they could be. They followed the established rules of war, even when their enemies spit on them. They treated their prisoners with dignity under galactic law. They put civilian safety ahead of their own military objectives. He paused, letting his words sink in. Perhaps we have been wrong to fear them so much. Ven was unmoved. One heroic act doesn't wash away 2 centuries of valid concern. Then, let's talk about the other problem, another counselor interjected. This was from the Avish Collective, a species of renowned merchants. Earth has been locked in quarantine for 200 years. They have been developing all of their technology in complete isolation. Our intelligence reports suggest their weapons are, in some cases, decades ahead of the galactic standard. Their ships are tougher. Their soldiers are deadlier. If we keep them penned up, they will only get stronger, and our fear of them will only grow. Are you actually suggesting we lift the quarantine? Ven scoffed. I'm suggesting we think about it, the Avish counselor retorted. Because the only thing more dangerous than a powerful military species is a powerful military species that feels trapped and persecuted. I would much rather have them as allies than as bitter enemies. The debate raged on. Thesson sat back down, watching it all unfold. They could argue for days, even weeks, but he knew the decision was already made. Everyone in that room knew it. Earth had just proven they could not be contained. The only real question left was whether the rest of the galaxy would welcome them or foolishly try to stand in their way. On the far side of the galaxy, in the grand throne room of the Kreveth Dominion, Emperor Vorith stared at the combat data. Vorith was ancient for a Kreveth. He'd lived through 3 major wars and had been victorious in 2. He knew power, and more importantly, he knew when he was staring at a force he could never defeat. The reports from Drexen's fleet left no room for doubt. The humans were superior in nearly every way imaginable. What were our total losses? Vorith asked his war council, his voice quiet. 7 capital ships, my emperor. Roughly 300 support vessels. Over 15,000 ground troops are either dead or have been captured. The councilman hesitated. And the humans? 5 soldiers were killed in ground operations. 37 were wounded. They didn't lose a single ship. A few were damaged, but all of them are still fully operational. Vorith closed his weary eyes. Send a diplomatic envoy to Earth, he commanded. Tell them the Dominion wishes to discuss terms. Terms, my emperor? One of his advisors asked, confused. Peace terms, surrender terms, whatever they want to call them. We are not fighting these people. We cannot win. The room was filled with stunned silence. The Kravath Dominion did not surrender. They conquered, but Vorith had survived for so long by knowing when it was time to fold. My emperor, what about our honor? Our honor is meaningless if our entire species is extinct, Vorith snapped. I've seen the footage. I know what their weapons can do. If we continue this fight, they will come for our home world, and they will burn it to the ground. We made a grave error when we attacked the Dolphin. We will correct that mistake now before it costs us absolutely everything. The meeting took place 3 days later at a neutral space station. Vorith sent his most experienced negotiators, who walked in expecting the usual song and dance of galactic diplomacy. Some minor concessions, maybe a trade of territory, a small payment of tribute. Captain Dan Reed, leading the human delegation, didn't bother with the pleasantries. He sat down across from the Kravath and got straight to the point. Here are our terms, he said flatly. a full and immediate withdrawal from all Dolene territory, reparations to be paid in full to cover all reconstruction costs, war crime trials for any Cravath officers found to have violated galactic law, and a formal public apology to the Dolphine people. The lead Cravath negotiator stared, utterly baffled. Those terms are excessive. Those terms are generous, Dan countered. Your forces were committing genocide. By galactic law, we have the right to demand far, far more. We could have your entire leadership on trial. The Council will never approve such harsh terms. The Council had its chance to stop you. They did nothing. We stopped you. So frankly, the Council's opinion doesn't mean very much to us right now. Dan leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the negotiators. Here's what you need to understand. Earth doesn't want your planets. We have no interest in conquering you. We just want you to stop hurting people who can't fight back. You can either accept these terms, or we will come to your homeworld and enforce them ourselves. The negotiator's face went pale. You would invade our homeworld? Only if you force our hand, Dan said calmly. We would much prefer peace. But we are more than willing to fight if that's what it takes. The Cravath agreed to every single demand. Vorth had already given them clearance to accept any terms that prevented the war from continuing. The humans were simply too dangerous to provoke. News of the stunning agreement flashed across the galaxy in a matter of hours. The Cravath Dominion, one of the most feared military powers in the known galaxy, had completely surrendered to a species most people hadn't even heard of a week ago. The Galactic Council met again. This time, there was no debate. The vote was swift and decisive. They formally lifted Earth's 200-year-old quarantine status. They really had no other choice. Trying to keep humanity locked away was no longer just impossible. It was a terrible idea. Thesson flew to Dolene space to deliver the news to Admiral Helen Cross personally. She was on the bridge of her flagship, overseeing the massive reconstruction effort. So that's it? We're allowed to travel freely now? Helen asked. Yes, Thesson confirmed. You have full access to Council space. You can set up trade deals, join diplomatic missions, and participate in all Council activities. Thesson paused. But you should be aware, most species are still terrified of you. Because we're good at fighting? Helen asked. Because you're good at everything you need to be, he corrected her. Fighting, protecting, building. You adapt in ways most of us can't. You didn't just survive on a death world that should have wiped you out. It made you stronger. Thesson looked out the viewport at the planet below, where human engineers were working side by side with Dolene construction teams. The galaxy has never seen anyone like humanity. Some will hate you for what you are. Others will admire you for it. But I promise you, none of us will ever forget what you did here. Helen kept her eyes on the planet, which was slowly, painstakingly coming back to life. We didn't do any of this to scare people, she said. We did it because it was the right thing to do. I know, Thesson replied. And that's what scares them the most. You're not conquerors. You're not merchants chasing a profit. You are idealists who have the power to actually enforce your ideals. The galaxy has no idea what to do with that. They'll figure it out, Helen said with a faint smile. Or they won't. Either way, we're here to stay. and the next time someone out there calls for help, we're going to answer." Thesson flew back to the Council's headquarters. In his final report, he recommended that humanity be granted full membership status. The motion passed, but only by a razor-thin margin. Yet even as the Council cast their votes, a flood of messages was already arriving at Earth. Messages from dozens of smaller species, all asking for an alliance.
Imagine your entire world is on fire, and the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy just watch. That's what happened to my people. Then, a distress call reached a forgotten corner of the universe, and the one species everyone called monsters showed up to help. What happens when your only saviors are the galaxy's biggest bogeymen? You're about to find out. In just 1 week, humanity's entire reputation had flipped. They went from being the terrifying boogeymen from a quarantined planet to the heroes who answered the call, the ones who stood up for the little guy. As Admiral Cross sifted through a mountain of new alliance requests, she couldn't help but smile. This changed everything. 6 months, that's all it took. Walking through the rebuilt streets of his capital, Aaron was amazed. Human engineers had shared their incredible technology without asking for a thing in return. Buildings that should have taken years to fix were already standing tall. The scars from the war were still there, but you could see they were starting to heal. Today was special. He and his top scientist, Lisa, had been invited to tour one of the human warships, the UES Valiant, which was Captain Reed's flagship. As their shuttle docked, Aaron stepped into a reality he could barely process. The ship was unbelievably huge on the inside, with hallways that seemed to stretch on into infinity. Everything was built for function, not for show. There was no art, no fancy decorations, just clean, cold metal and a powerful sense of purpose. A man named Dan greeted them at the airlock. "Counselor Aaron, it's an honor to have you aboard." "The honor is all ours, Captain," Aaron replied, his voice filled with emotion. "You saved our people. We owe you more than we can ever repay." Dan just looked a little awkward with the praise. "We just did what anyone would have done," he said, changing the subject. "Come on, let me show you around." As they walked, Aaron watched the human crew. They all moved with a kind of speed and purpose that seemed to come from living their entire lives in a higher gravity. They were a whirlwind of constant, efficient motion. Just watching them was almost tiring. Lisa, of course, was firing off questions a mile a minute. "How does your artificial gravity generator work? What's the fuel source for your reactors? What kind of shielding protects you from cosmic radiation?" Dan answered every single one with incredible patience. Some of their technology was mind-blowingly advanced, but some of it was so simple it was almost scary. The humans had solved problems the rest of the galaxy had written off as impossible, simply by deciding they weren't. When they got to the observation deck, Aaron stared down at his home world spinning below. From up here, it looked so peaceful, almost whole again. The scorched parts of the continents were fading, and life was coming back. "Why did you do it?" Aaron asked out of the blue. "You didn't owe us anything. You didn't even know we existed before our distress signal. Why would you risk everything for total strangers?" Dan was silent for a long moment. "Do you know what it feels like to be completely alone? To be shut out because everyone is terrified of you?" Aaron shook his head. Earth was under a galactic quarantine for 200 years.
We were labeled too dangerous to even talk to. We built our ships and trained our soldiers with no one to protect but ourselves. When we heard your call, we heard someone who needed help that nobody else was willing to give. We remembered exactly how it felt to be abandoned. Dan looked Aaron straight in the eye. We came because somebody had to. Because when you're scared, alone, and about to die, it shouldn't matter what species you are. When you call for help, someone should answer. Lisa quietly wiped a tear from her eye. The old legends were true, she whispered. You really are guardians. We're just people, Dan said softly, trying to do the right thing. They spent another hour on the Valiant. Dan took them to the medical bay, where human doctors had pioneered new ways to treat his people's injuries. He showed them the engine room, where human and Dolene engineers were already working together on new hybrid technologies. And then he showed them the memorial wall, where the names of the 5 Marines who didn't make it home were etched into the metal. We remember every single person we lose, Dan said, his voice low. Everyone. When they took the shuttle back down to the planet, Lisa was already scrolling through her data pad. The human government just sent a formal proposal, she said, her eyes wide. A full mutual defense treaty, military alliance, technology sharing, even cultural exchange programs. What should we do? I think, Aaron said with a smile, we should sign it without a moment's hesitation. The humans are the best allies anyone could ever ask for. The treaty was signed a week later, marking the first official alliance between Earth and an alien species. President Garcia came in person, along with Admiral Cross and Captain Reed. The whole ceremony was broadcast live on both of their worlds. Today we are forging a friendship that was born in the fires of war, President Garcia declared. The Dothene called for help and Earth answered. Now, we promise to always stand together, to defend one another, and to build a brighter future for us all. Aaron signed the treaty with hands that trembled only slightly. Lisa stood beside him, a symbol of their scientific community. The moment it was done, the crowd went wild with cheers. It was a beautiful sight, Dothine and humans celebrating not just their survival, but a newfound sense of hope. The treaty's impact was felt almost overnight. Soon, other species started reaching out to Earth. The small-time traders of the Helan Federation, the peaceful farmers of the Avish Collective, the mining colonies way out on the outer rim. They all had similar stories of being pushed around or ignored by the big galactic powers, and they all wanted what the Dolene now had, a partnership and protection from Earth. Admiral Cross suddenly found herself in charge of a completely new kind of fleet, which they called the Terran Defense Initiative. It wasn't just human ships anymore. It was a mix of vessels from a dozen different species. They ran drills together, they patrolled trade routes together, and they quickly became a symbol of something brand new in the galaxy. A coalition built not on fear or greed, but on the simple idea that the strong have a duty to protect the weak. The Galactic Council watched all of this unfold with very mixed emotions. Some were glad to see the new stability the Terran Defense Initiative brought to volatile regions. Others were getting nervous about Earth's rapidly growing influence, but no one could argue with the results. Space piracy plummeted. Petty border wars fizzled out. Species that had been enemies for generations were now sitting down at negotiating tables with human mediators. Thesson, the Council's chief diplomat, visited Earth for the first time since the quarantine was lifted. He toured the planet that had given the galaxy nightmares for centuries. He saw the incredible cities they had built in their brutally harsh environment. He saw the towering mountains and violent oceans that would make most other species physically ill just looking at them. He saw a world that had tried its best to crush its own inhabitants and had failed completely. President Garcia met him in a garden that shouldn't have been able to exist. The gravity was heavy enough to be uncomfortable for galactic norms, and the weather was wild and unpredictable, but it was undeniably beautiful. "So," Garcia asked with a small smile, "are you convinced we're not monsters yet?" "I was never convinced you were monsters, Madam President," Thesson replied. "I was just afraid of what you might become if you chose to be." He looked up at the planet's intensely blue sky. "I get it now. I understand why you fight so hard. This world taught you that strength is necessary for survival, but it also taught you that just surviving isn't enough. You need a community, a purpose. You need something worth protecting." "We're far from perfect," Garcia admitted. "We've made our share of mistakes, and I'm sure we'll make plenty more." "But you try," Thesson interrupted. "That's the part that matters. You see an injustice, and you do something about it. You see suffering, and you help. The galaxy has been missing that for a very, very long time." They finished their walk through the garden in a comfortable silence. Later that evening, Thesson filed his final report. His recommendation was short and to the point. Welcome humanity into the galactic community with open arms. They had more than earned their place. Far, far away on a lonely monitoring station in deep space, a new alarm started blaring. Another distress beacon had just been activated. This one was from a species known as the Thanari. They were being hammered by raiders. Their defenses were about to collapse, and they were pleading for help. The alert popped up on Admiral Cross's desk while she was busy reviewing fleet schedules. She read the message twice, then immediately pulled up the star charts. The Thanari system was a 3-week journey at top speed. Without a moment of hesitation, she sent out the orders. "All available ships, prepare for immediate deployment. We've got a situation." Within hours, the Terran Defense Initiative was on the move. Human warships formed the heart of the fleet, but this time they were joined by Dolin cruisers, Offish supply ships, and Helion scout vessels. It was a coalition fleet, a dozen species strong, all moving as one. From the bridge of the Valiant, Dan watched the massive fleet come together. It was even bigger than the one that had saved the Dolin, more diverse, more powerful. And it carried a message that was starting to echo across the entire galaxy. If you need help, someone will answer the call. Before they left, President Garcia addressed the entire fleet. Her voice was broadcast to every ship, every crew member, from every species represented. "We are not going as conquerors," she said, her voice firm. "We are going as defenders. We are not doing this for glory, but because it is the right thing to do. We go because someone is calling for help, and we will not let them face the darkness all alone. This is who we are. This is what we choose to be. Earth and our allies, standing together for those who can't stand for themselves." The fleet then jumped to faster-than-light speed, and behind them, Earth continued its quiet orbit around its sun. That little blue marble, once feared and locked away, was now becoming the heart of something new and wonderful. Aaron watched the fleet's departure from his office window, with Lisa standing right beside him, tracking their energy signatures. "They're really going to do this every time, aren't they?" Lisa asked in awe. "Every distress call, every species that's in trouble." "Yes," Aaron said softly. "Because that's just who they are. The galaxy is changing because of them. In fact, it already has." In the deep, silent darkness between the stars, the combined fleet journeyed onward toward another world that needed them. They carried powerful weapons and incredible technology, that much was true. But they carried something far more important. They carried hope. The hope that when you're at your lowest point, when all seems lost and the darkness is closing in, someone will come. See, on a little blue world they called Earth, a race of people shaped by endless conflict and tough times had figured out one basic truth. They learned that the most powerful thing you could be wasn't a warlord who takes over everything. It was a guardian who defends it. And so humanity, the legendary Deathworlders from that so-called nightmare planet, finally found their calling. They were the ones who stepped up when help was needed, and because of them, the galaxy was changed forever.